It's a Woman Crush Wednesday. Join Professor Buzzkill as he crushes on women from history who deserve more fame and glory.
Yes, it's a Woman Crush Wednesday, and it is the Professor Buzzkill History Podcast, busting myths, taking names, and fortunately, once again, we're here with an accomplished author, accomplished scholar who's written a great book called The Confidante, the untold story of the woman who helped win World War II and shaped modern America. Of course, the person I'm talking about is Christopher Gorham, who's on the line on the interwebs. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Professor Buzzkill, for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, as we were talking before we started the show, we like to, not only in these Women Crush Wednesday shows, but generally speaking, talk about the people who are unheralded and unsung, yet who did more or less all the work, and all the big heroes, all the statesmen and famous people get all the credit. And you can't find a person in 20th century American history with more accomplishments than
Anna Rosenberg.
Absolutely. Rosenberg is right, yeah. It's amazing. I didn't know any of this, and I was floored.
Well, she was a famous person in the 40s and 50s on magazine covers, in the New York Times, in Time, in Life, and her story has become obscure over the decades after that. So glad to be bringing her back into the discussion.
Well, another person we want to bring into the discussion just quickly is one of our great Patreon supporters, and that's Elizabeth Santos, who is a big fan of the show and will love this episode. So it was a shout out to Elizabeth for sponsoring this episode. And please, the book is so great, by the way, Buzzkillers. It's on the Buzzkill bookshelf. There's a free copy available for one of our lucky Patreon supporters. But it's so rich and so full. Her career from the 30s to the 1960s is so packed. We don't have time to talk about the whole thing on the show. But we do have time, I hope, to talk about her World War II life and experiences. Now,
Sure.
Now, the one thing, Chris, is you're going to have to stop me from jumping in over enthusiastically and finishing your sentences and telling the story, because I just love it. And I think very wisely, and also makes the book so interesting, is you start off in the prologue in the Eagle's Nest. Now, Buzzkillers should know that the Eagle's Nest is Hitler's retreat up in the mountains of Bavaria. So please, before I'll stop talking, and please you tell the story of Anna in the Eagle's Nest.
Well, she had a hidden hand in the policies that helped the United States win World War II, both domestically and with respect to what was going on in the European theater. She was sent to the European theater 2 times. The second time, both by President Roosevelt. By the second trip in 1945, Roosevelt had died. So it was left to President Truman to sort of tell her, President Roosevelt wanted you to go on this mission and go ahead. I want you to go and do it. And it was to ostensibly look again at the state of the GIs, both what they needed, what they wanted on the battlefield. And also they were taking a study of what these guys wanted when they returned home. And that was going to, we'll talk later about it, I hope, but that was going to sort of give direction to the GI Bill. Her second mission in 1945, though, changed with the discovery of the concentration camps.
Yeah.
And the refugees that were flooding all through Europe, Jewish refugees and others. And Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley, the generals, they called Washington when they stumbled across these first concentration camps and saw the horrors. They cabled Washington and said, we want legislators, we want journalists, we want people to bear witness to this horror. So Anna Rosenberg's mission on the second trip changed. She was one of the first Allied women to go to a concentration camp. She saw the compound at Nordhausen, and described in the book something she didn't talk a lot about afterwards, you can imagine. Edward R. Murrow also went to Buchenwald and around the same time and also spoke very movingly about what he'd seen. On that second mission, after doing the work related to the refugees and the care of the refugees, Anna was able to fly to Bavaria and go to the Eagle's Nest. She was accompanied by her son, who was an officer in the Signal Corps, her son Thomas, and she, got in the elevator in this mountain, and it goes up to, this very modern. It's just crazy to think that Hitler lived there or part-time lived there. goes into this modern gleaming bathroom kitchen area. And then, she walks through that and she's in this big, huge octagonal room with the view of the valley below. And she's in the eagle's nest, and just absolutely crazy. And while she's there, she read German. She spoke German and Hungarian from when her girlhood in Budapest in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So she was able to read the German titles on the bookshelf. She pulls off a book that says 10 years of Hitler, 10 years of Roosevelt, and it's this anti-Roosevelt screed. And she's flipping through it, and there's a picture of her friend and mentor, Bernard Baruch, who was Jewish, and, saying terrible things about him. And she took that book and just slipped it into her handbag. And that was a souvenir for Baruch when she got back to the United States.
Yeah, well, it's an amazing sort of, pardon the obvious play on words here, but amazing crowning achievement to go to the heights of the eagle's nest and see that, and to sort of get into what is, after all, probably the most private, the most personal of Hitler's libraries. It's, after all, his retreat. But as you quite rightly point out in the book, in the first half of the book anyway, this is just one of many things during the war that she does. Not only the getting into the eagle's nest, but the concentration camps, but also in the very early stages of the war. So now that we've reached the heights of the eagle's nest, let's back up. And again, without me jumping in to rush and tell the story out of excitement, how does she get involved in the Roosevelt administration and then in the war effort?
Well, going back even to the late 1920s, she was a successful labor advisor and labor consultant. And the Roosevelts knew her going back to Governor Roosevelt. In the 30s, she was a New Deal executive, still mostly related to labor and the use of the skillful deployment of labor. As World War II is on the horizon, it's before Pearl Harbor, but the sense is that the United States is going to wind up having to fight, and the factories are starting to crank up, and the contracts are starting to be placed. One of the first issues where Anna was helpful was Black leaders, A. Philip Randolph and Walter White of the NAACP, were complaining to Roosevelt and Roosevelt's people that Black Americans weren't being given the opportunity to get some of these good-paying defense jobs that were now popping up all across the country at the ports and the shipyards and the factories. And Roosevelt he pushed these guys off. He could be very condescending to these Black leaders, but they weren't going to be pushed away. So they kept up their campaign to be treated fairly in the defense industries. And Roosevelt had to sort of figure out how to solve this problem. And he pulls in, obviously, Eleanor Roosevelt and a guy named Aubrey Williams, who is a well-known liberal New Dealer with the Black community, and Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor of New York City, and Anna Rosenberg. And those four, particularly Rosenberg and the mayor, became the point people for what is going to become Executive Order 8802, which was the mandate that defense industries hire Black Americans. And if the executive order had not been drafted and issued by Roosevelt, there was going to be a march on Washington on July 4th, 1941. And President Roosevelt was very, very worried, as was Eleanor, as was his people, that could result in violence.
Yeah.
You have, Black Americans marching. You have, Washington is a southern city, southern police force, sort of. And there was a real worry that this could be a Black eye around the world right at the time when the United States had to show unity. So Anna Rosenberg, being a mediator, a professional mediator, had an enormous role in drafting the executive order and then cajoling the president to sign it, and which he finally did. And the march was called off, and Black Americans were welcomed into the defense industries.
One of the many things I find so fascinating about the Roosevelt administration, though, is, and this happens in some administrations, but not all, FDR and the higher-ups in the administration were able to see someone like Anna Rosenberg's abilities and yet not totally pigeonhole her as just a labor person.
That's absolutely right. The nickname she earned was 7-Job Anna, and she had an array of skills. She is going to pivot from sort of labor to almost a sort of quasi-military role, a series of quasi-military roles. It's through the labor that this happens. she met George Marshall, for instance, the chief of staff after the war was on, the United States was in the war. She had an opportunity to meet George Marshall because very, very qualified engineers and machinists and guys that we really needed to be building, bombs and tanks and the weapons of war were being picked up as privates and ensigns in the Navy.
Yeah.
Low-level military guys. And it was just a poor allocation of resources. So they had to get together, Anna Rosenberg and with the War Manpower Commission, and talk to Marshall and figure out, we need some of these guys to stay in the United States and be working in the arms industry. And that was a relationship the beginning of a relationship that lasted all the way through the Korean War, which we can maybe talk about later. But he was, again, won over by this woman's skill. And that was part of how she was able to pivot from sort of these civilian labor jobs to more of a, sort of quasi-military or military role related to manpower, both what was called manpower, but personnel, not only in the factories here at home, but in the eventually the manpower or the personnel that was deployed overseas, both in World War II and the Korean War.
Well, please give us some more detail about this manpower role she has, because that's something that's often forgotten. There are no movies, there's no Saving Private Ryan about raising the force or any of the hard work that has to go into building the American military at this time, and she's part of it.
Right. I know you're interested in Winston Churchill,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll bring him in for this story. When Churchill visited Roosevelt in the lead up to planning D-Day, both leaders knew that it was going to be a question really of logistics. They were going to need a deep water port, and they were going to need, division after division after division of reinforcements, and they were going to just need millions and millions of dollars of materiel to be, flooding France as they raced across France and into Germany. And the success of D-Day was going to hinge both on the courage of the fighters that were going to be there, but also on the material that we were able to build here in the United States. And one of the problems at that moment in the United States in late 43, early 44 was a labor issue. And guys were quitting jobs at the stinky shipyards and at the ironworks, and they were going to work at the aircraft factories where conditions were a lot better. You had windows, you had this big cavernous factory where they were building. It was a lot cleaner. It was a lot safer.
Yeah.
It became an issue because contracts were imperiled. And, we're trying to get Britain stuff. We're trying to get the Soviet Union aircraft and things and tanks. And it was not working well. In comes Anna Rosenberg, one of the areas where the United States was just pumping out aircraft, ordnance, artillery, just everything you can think of related to war, was the Buffalo, Niagara region in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And it was teetering. Labor piracy, there was absenteeism, there was all kinds of problems related to that. And it was, like I said, imperiling the contracts and imperiling really the plans for D-Day upcoming. Anna Rosenberg is sent there by Roosevelt and develops this plan where the contours of it are in the book. We don't really have time to go into it now, but essentially it was a centralized plan where people could leave their job, but only to go to sort of the factories that had the greatest need, and they were all graded out, A, B, C, D, and so forth. And it essentially solved the labor issues in the Buffalo, Niagara region, and it was rolled out nationwide in the aftermath of that. And Time magazine said, what was called the Rosenberg Plan or also the Buffalo Plan really paved the way for a successful deployment of the material after D-Day that was instrumental in winning the war. And, built in places like Buffalo, built in places like Youngstown, Ohio, built out in the shipyards of the West Coast. So the Buffalo Plan was a huge domestic effort by Anna Rosenberg. And you're exactly right. There's not going to be a movie about that, but that was as instrumental to the victory in 1944 and 45 as really anything.
Well, I say there aren't movies and there's not going to be movies, but what there were during the war is these little film promotional things showing, isn't it great how all this stuff is being produced? So there were morale building films and things like that, shorts. But yeah, it's just one of these things that people aren't going to write novels about, even though
Right.
without this stuff, the great heroes on the front lines wouldn't have gotten there. Now, the interesting one of the I shouldn't keep saying the interesting thing, Buzzkillers, because there are only about 40 million interesting things in this book. But this is someone without a great deal of formal education. You didn't have in the 20s and 30s, and you couldn't go in and out and major in organizational studies and things like that. So how does she sort of get this genius for organization and for this type of management?
I want to go back just for 1 second, talk about the morale.
Mm-hmm.
Great point that you made. And she was part of what she had to do in Buffalo. It was increase the morale of the war workers. And it wasn't fun to go to the midnight shift. If you were a woman with a child, a single woman, if you were, these women were working in the middle of the night at these factories. It wasn't fun. It was a tremendous sacrifice. And she did a lot of things to raise morale. And one of the little stories is she was standing next to a young woman who was just punching out, rivets on this machine, monotonous work, just 10 hours a day working on this machine. And the young woman, Anna Rosenberg, said, she had a look on her face that, her sort of eyes were glazed over. So Anna says to her, do you know what this little part does? And the young woman said, no. And she took her arm and she said, well, let's go find out. So they traipsed through the factory, and lo and behold, they find out that she was building the part of a gun sight for the either the bombardier or the gunner. And it was a very important part of the aircraft. And the woman's mien just changed. The young war worker, she had a sense of, all right, I'm doing this to help. I'm doing my little part to help win the war. And that was something that Anna Rosenberg always wanted to reinforce, that these were not just monotonous jobs that were meaningless. And she told the managers, make sure that your people know this. These little things, no matter how small, are to the greater good of defeating Nazism.
Well, and if you get a gun sight wrong, if you shave it off by a millimeter or whatever, then it's practically worthless. So it's extremely vital.
Right, and lives might be imperiled, so it had to be done right, absolutely. How Anna Rosenberg, her sort of genius for organization and for sort of deployment of personnel was, I think, the result of her ability, which was very, very rare, to both have the respect of union people, union workers, and they felt that she spoke to them, that she was in favor of what they were after. They trusted her. A union man said, if Anna tells us something, we know she's on the level. At the same time, she had the respect of the management class, and it was just so very rare to one of the factory owners said, an hour of her time would have saved me $10,000.
Yeah.
So she was able to get these two sides together. She would tell management, like I said, if you are transparent to your workers about the importance of the work they do, whether it's in pharmaceuticals, whether it's in building bomb sites, tell your workers why it's important what they're doing. And, instead of punishing them if they're not doing what you think they wanted, instead of punishing them as corporations had done in the 30s and 20s, Anna was more sort of give them the carrot, give them some Americanization classes, give them some, a baseball league or a softball league, and give them that transparency and treat them like human beings. And they will have a loyalty and they'll work hard for you. And that was sort of the magic that she was able to bring to her work, was the respect of the management, the respect of the union guys. And it worked. She was brilliant at what she did.
Yes, and we shouldn't forget, I think what is a sort of overarching, very general myth is that everyone pitched in immediately and forgot any pre-war labor disputes or anything. But in reality, these workers these workers as a class were still working for their old bosses as a class.
Yes.
So it's not as if overnight the head of, I'm just saying GM, I don't know whether this is a specific example. The head of GM, when he starts to have to make Jeeps and stuff, all of a sudden becomes super patriotic and pro-worker, and then all the workers believe that now that we're fighting for, we have this unity and of understanding with our employers. There's a lot of pre-war, grumblings about labor relations that existed well into the war effort.
You're absolutely right. It's a myth that everyone was ultra patriotic and just, the women would put on the bandanas and, go off to work, and the men would do so willingly. I will tell you two stories, one about management and one about sort of the rank and file. Management, the head of Montgomery Ward, Roosevelt, again, sending Anna Rosenberg around the country really to say to unions, union leaders, striking right now during World War II is not a great idea. Please don't do it. And sometimes, she had to put the hammer down, but other times all she had was President Roosevelt's word. And most times that was good enough.
By the way, we need to remind Buzzkillers, especially the younger ones, Montgomery Ward was a department store, but also a catalog store. You would order things through a catalog to get there. It was as huge as Sears at one time.
Right. Massive outfit. Right. You're exactly right. I forget the head of it at the time. But, and then Roosevelt and Rosenberg would go around to management and say, if you treat your workers a little bit better and you spend a little bit more on them, they're less likely to strike. And we really can't have strikes and work stoppages during wartime. Well, I believe his name was Sewell, the head of Montgomery Ward. He just wasn't going to play ball. He hated Roosevelt. He hated the New Deal. He was just, forget you. I'm not listening to any of this. If there's a strike, there's a strike, and so be it. Roosevelt had to send a jeep full of GIs, they literally picked this guy up. They went to his office, in downtown Chicago, picked this guy up and carried him out of that building. And he wound up complying. But it was a serious thing. You just couldn't have work stoppages and strikes during World War II because it imperiled lives overseas.
Absolutely.
On the Union side, like you said, the myth of everyone just being ultra patriotic. On the Union side, the crazy thing was the Manhattan Project was employing 130,000 people at secret sites across the country.
This is the project that first designs and then helps build the atomic bombs.
Absolutely right. The Manhattan Project is sort of developing, designing, and then ultimately testing the bomb and getting it ready for use. And there's sites in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, not to mention Chicago and New York City. Well, what happened was, this is a great story that Anna loved to tell, is if you had workers at one of these locations doing sophisticated work on sort of the guts of the bomb, eventually, if they were working there long enough on this particular job, they would figure out what they were working on. They would figure out that they were, trying to smash atoms together and create, this unleashing of energy to be weaponized. So after 60 days or after 90 days, whole sections of these workers would just be laid off. No one would say a word why. Your 90 days is up, off you go. So they were upset, and they went to their union leader, and they said, or they went to their labor leader and said, let's unionize because we're being mistreated. And if they were unionized, which they had the legal right to do, it would have been publicized because the law was such that there would be hearings about the unionization of these workers. And to publicize this was to blow the cover of the Manhattan Project. So once again, Roosevelt calls in Mrs. Fix-It and says, I need you to go talk to these labor leaders and get them to stand down. And Eleanor Roosevelt says, Anna, how can you do this? They have the legal right to unionize. And nevertheless, she goes and she talks to these labor leaders and says, I don't have anything other than President Roosevelt's good faith. You have the legal right to unionize, your people do, but I have to ask you, this is a question of national security, and it comes from the very, very top. The boss doesn't want you to do this. And lo and behold, they stood down, and the secrecy of the atomic bomb was maintained.
Yes, and so that shows that, she's not just the union's representative in the Roosevelt administration. She is willing to see the bigger picture.
Absolutely, absolutely. And she, seeing the big picture was, I think, most revealed in understanding almost immediately that this was a war different from others in that it was going to be an entire society had to be mobilized. The women had to be mobilized. Even high schoolers had to take a role sometimes in manning the factories or staffing the factories. Women had to play an ever greater role in making sacrifices that would lead to victory. So that understanding that an entire society would be marshaled towards victory was something that she saw right away and shared with Roosevelt, that sort of understanding almost immediately that World War II was going to be different. It was going to be a war of societies, and it was going to be a war where the factories were going to be as important as the battlefield.
Well, this is a good time for us to take a little break for sponsorship ads and to hear from the people who actually support the show. So we'll do that, and then we can come back and talk about her transition from the sort of labor world to actually being in Europe. So back in a second, Buzzkillers. All right, Buzzkillers, we are back talking with Christopher Gorham about his wonderful new book, The Confidante, the untold story of the woman who helped win World War II and shape modern America. Now, before we left for a break, we talked about Anna Rosenberg's work in the war effort in industry and things like that. But then how does she transfer or become actually involved in the European theater? She actually goes there. How does that start?
That's right. I think it started, to be honest with you, when President Wilson sent a young Franklin Roosevelt over to World War I as his emissary to sort of see what was going on. And Roosevelt would have loved to have been able to go in the weeks after D-Day and travel over to Europe and see the men, see the GIs that were fighting. And obviously he couldn't do that, being in a wheelchair. But he, like Wilson before, he sent Anna Rosenberg, and that's just a remarkable thing. Wilson sent Roosevelt. Roosevelt is going to send Anna Rosenberg as his personal emissary to go over to Europe. This is only a month after or 6 weeks after D-Day, to go over to France, to go with the First Army and the Third Army as they're moving out of the pocket in Normandy and see what the soldiers wanted, how the food was, how their equipment was. He said, lift up the soup pot, check the foot locker, do they have dry socks? But more importantly, he sent her over because in June of 44, Congress had sent him the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which we know is the GI Bill of Rights.
Right.
And the GI Bill is this, what we understand it now, this massive program to educate these GIs when they returned home, which transformed the middle class. But at the time, the GI Bill was sort of written on a napkin. And Roosevelt, the only thing that they really agreed upon was they didn't want to treat the World War II vets as shabbily as they treated the World War I vets. The World War I vets got like a $60 and a train ride home and nothing else. So Roosevelt really wanted Anna Rosenberg to sort of figure out what the dreams were for these soldiers when they returned home, if they returned home. And she was very surprised to learn. And Roosevelt was also surprised when she reported to him that what these men wanted was an education. It wasn't vocational training. It wasn't dance lessons. These guys wanted a chance to be educated when they returned home, to go to college and to participate in the economy that they'd helped save with their fighting. And this was a, notebook after notebook. Anna Rosenberg wrote down, she's with these guys, eating rations on the hood of a Jeep.
Yeah.
She's sleeping in tents. She's dodging sniper fire at one point. And, these guys would say to her candidly, if I were a lieutenant now, or if I had an education, I'd be lieutenant. If I had an education when I got home, I'm going to be able to, improve my lot and maybe become a dentist, maybe become a doctor, or maybe go to law school, or, own my own factory someday. So these guys had real dreams, and education was at the heart of those dreams. And when she reported back to President Roosevelt, she said he lit up. This was sort of the beginning of the direction of what became the GI Bill that we understand, the educational thrust, which was just transformative to American history.
Yes, but that is also sort of, if you will, not dissimilar to the work that she's doing, because it's sort of dealing with soldiers as workers. Soldiers were having the right to a pension, and on and on and on. How then did she move on to concentration camps? And the other thing, it's like they see the genius of Anna Rosenberg, and they say, as you said at the very beginning, all right, well, let's give this to the woman with 7 jobs, because she's got 7 major skills.
Yeah, she. I think that point about seeing soldiers as workers is such a great point, Joe. Absolutely. She wanted them to have everything they needed to succeed, both on the battlefield and afterwards. And she understood, like Roosevelt, that we were a country, the United States was a country that was great enough to provide for a future for these millions of returning soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that was very important to the president and very important to Anna Rosenberg. 7-job Anna, she had an array of skills, and her grandson told me something that was very interesting. He said, she had the skill, or again, like you said, she wasn't formally educated, but just a smart cookie. She could get into these rooms of power with leaders of business, with senators, with politicians, with presidents. And Thomas Rosenberg, her grandson, said, and she could stay there. She had the social grace to stay there. And that's why she's also such a rare figure, because not only was she the confidant of Franklin Roosevelt, but Truman. And she helped Eisenhower pivot from soldier to statesman. And Lyndon Johnson was a friend of hers from 1937 all the way until 1974, the rest of his life. So it's this incredible ability to be trusted and respected and relied upon by tremendously powerful individuals decade after decade after decade.
So then when she gets to Europe on the ground, what's the sort of first, Buzzkillers, I can't help biting my tongue because I know all this stuff because I went through the book like a freight train. What's the first thing she does, and then how does that eventually end up at the Eagle's Nest?
Well, so the 1944 trip that Roosevelt sent her on, it was a success. It was eye-opening for President Roosevelt and for the GI Bill. So he decided that he would send her back in 1945. And, the sort of the poignant part of the book is he summoned her to Washington to tell her about this second trip. And I believe it was the last lunch that he ever had. It was a one-on-one lunch with Anna Rosenberg up in the sunroom of the White House. I think it was the last lunch that Franklin Roosevelt ever had at the White House, because he left for Hyde Park, and then he left down to Georgia, and of course died just a couple of weeks later, shockingly. At that lunch meeting, though, with Anna, he suggested that she visit Europe again and do a follow-up of what she'd done in 44, sort of related to the state of the GIs and the GI Bill. But when she got over there, and again, Truman had to sort of sign off on this trip. When she got over there, what they found on the ground was this horrible scene of millions of refugees. And Truman wanted Rosenberg to not only talk to the soldiers that she'd done in 44, but gave her this other role: go to Paris and see if you can help sort out the French Jewish refugee problem. So she was sent to Paris to do that. And then, as I said before, Eisenhower and the generals really wanted witnesses to the horrors of the concentration camps, so that it just wouldn't be forgotten. And the horrors were almost unbelievable. So if you have witnesses, they can give credence to that, to what was going on. So she went to the Nordhausen concentration camp, where they were building the V-2 rockets in the middle of a mountain. Just unspeakable horrors she saw, both for men and for women that were there. And again, didn't speak a lot about that afterwards, but raised millions and millions and millions of dollars for refugees in 1946 and 47, which is also described in the book. And as I mentioned, also her son was an officer overseas. So after witnessing the concentration camp, she and Thomas, her son, got on a plane and flew to the mountains and were able to go up to the Eagle's Nest. And, just imagining this woman who had been born in Budapest during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had her family been sort of kicked out of the empire. And I just think of her, gazing into that valley, not all that far from where she grew up, here at the end of a Second World War, one that had been so transformative and so devastating to the world. What a life. What a lifetime.
What a life indeed. And one of the things is then, and maybe she didn't, obviously, maybe she didn't think of this, and the workers back in Buffalo didn't think of this, but when you talk about the assembly line worker for whom she pulled off the assembly line to say this is what the bomb site does, and blah, 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 if she could have somehow conveyed back to that specific assembly line worker, I'm in Hitler's eagle's nest, and he's dead, and I'm looking at all kinds of things, and we're having a sort of victory tour here, partly because of you and that specific bomb site.
Yeah, it must have been very gratifying to her to know that these anonymous people, millions of them, in Buffalo, in Detroit, in Portland, Oregon, had, white, black, men, women, had helped this ultimate victory.
Well, we can't leave the Buzzkillers with it's a fantastic career. It would have been a fantastic career if she had retired, even if at this point she'd retired and that had been the end of her actual work. But we don't want to tell the whole story because, of course, we want them to get the book because it's unputdownable, as they say. Give us some of the highlights for the rest of her life. Give us some of the sort of the really exciting parts, culminating with that famous birthday dinner with JFK.
Sure. It's very nice of you to say, too, about the book, unputdownable. Thank you for that.
It is unputdownable. I couldn't put it down.
I love it. Well, after World War II, Anna was involved in veterans affairs very much. But at some point, she had to go back and earn a living. So she sort of retired from government work insofar as she could, as she was able to. And in 1950, she's in her, apartment on Fifth Avenue, and she opens up a letter. And the letter was from George Marshall, who had been the architect of victory in World War II. And then he had been sort of pulled out of retirement by President Truman to become Secretary of Defense during the desperate early days of the Korean War. And this handwritten letter says, Anna, would you consider coming down to the Pentagon with me and being my Assistant Secretary of Defense? Because our Army, after World War II, has been decimated by budget cuts. The personnel aren't there. We have to occupy West Germany, Japan, and we have to fight the Cold War. And now we have a war in Korea. Come down and help me. So she became the Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Korean War. And it's just a remarkable thing, civilian woman, middle-aged civilian woman. One day she's in Fifth Avenue apartment, and, the next day it wasn't the next day because she had to overcome a terrible smear campaign from Joe McCarthy, which I describe in the book.
Yes,
but,
that's another, again, gripping, unputdownable chapter.
It sure is. And, you think about, as I was writing that and researching that part of the book where Joe McCarthy and a sort of cabal of extremists attack her on anti-Semitic grounds, you're kind of reminded of how nasty politics can still be today. And, where baseless accusations are thrown around. But she overcame that because that's who she was. And she opened that big, huge door to the Pentagon and was Assistant Secretary of Defense in charge of rebuilding the American Army to succeed in the Cold War. And the only president of that whole line of presidents that maybe didn't mistreat her, but didn't utilize Anna as much as she might have been utilized is John F. Kennedy. So she had been, again, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower cared a lot about Anna and used her talents and trusted her. But you get to John F. Kennedy, and he just wasn't interested in having a lot of women in his cabinet or in his government. And Anna thought, and Eleanor Roosevelt said to John F. Kennedy, here's a woman who'd be a perfect cabinet position holder, Anna Rosenberg. She could be Secretary of Labor or Secretary of something else, and just not interested. He saw Anna Rosenberg as a fundraiser only. And being the loyal Democrat that she was, even though she was disappointed not to be in the Kennedy cabinet, she raised money for him. And sort of the most famous instance is the 1962 birthday gala when President Kennedy was turning 45. Anna Rosenberg was the co-host of that event. It was at Madison Square Garden. And Anna Rosenberg and her co-host, Arthur Krim, put together a list of all the entertainers. There was Danny Kaye, there was the ballet troupe, there was comedians, there were singers. And at the very, very end, of course, was Marilyn Monroe, who was going to be the capstone of the evening. And I think we can all picture Marilyn Monroe singing Happy Birthday, Mr. President. But if you look at the photos of that event or the video of that event, you can see the back of John F. Kennedy's head with the birthday cake and Marilyn Monroe in front of him. But right next to John F. Kennedy is the co-host, Anna Rosenberg.
Well, that's a great way to wrap up the show, because at the very least, I mean, even though she should have been Secretary of Labor,
sure,
at the very least she was in the spotlight for that moment until your book came out, and of course until this show came out. And Buzzkillers, we just want to say that this is really an unmissable book, and I read history books every day, and what a cold-hearted cynic I am, but this book really makes me think. Gives me a better appreciation for not only her skills and the skills of lots of women like her, but at least the temporary ability of FDR and Marshall and all these other people to put aside what they must have had some sexist sort of doubts in their mind, and also probably put aside criticism from some of their colleagues. What are you doing hiring this woman? Was there a lot of that?
You're absolutely right. George Marshall and Truman in 1950 knew they were going to get hammered by having a Jewish middle-aged woman, former New Dealer, come to the Pentagon. And they knew that was going to happen. But it speaks to her talents, because they also knew she was going to get the job done, and she did.
Yeah, I can imagine people like Robert Taft, Senator Taft, who's one of the really extremists and shockingly extreme for that time, just trying to go nuts.
You could imagine a ticket of Taft and MacArthur.
Yeah.
Oh boy, talk about World War III. Yeah, very scary.
Well, as lots of people like to say, and I think this is true, this is the reason Eisenhower ran for president, is to stop all that from happening. But that's another subject. We want to stress to Buzzkillers, this is a great book, that it's on the Buzzkill bookshelf. And again, because if you're a Patreon member, please respond to the post I put up and say you want a copy. And the copy I have to give out is an advanced reader copy. So you'll be kind of one of the kids in the in club, because you're getting the advanced publishing copy, and you can flaunt that on an airplane as if you're one of the insiders in the publishing and history world. So it just remains for me to thank you so much, Chris, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Professor Buzzkill and Buzzkillers. Thanks for having me today.
And everyone, please go out to ProfessorBuzzkill.com, follow us on all the socials and all that sort of stuff, and we will talk to all of you next week.